out of the three, this has by far, ladies and gentlemen, ultimate Japanese lightweight sports car comparison. 2024 Mazda MX-5 Miata, the ND3, 2023 Toyota GR86 base, and 2006 Honda S2000 AP2. We're gonna start with the GR86 because that's the one that I have the most experience with. I actually owned a base GR86 in Neptune Blue for about a year and a half, and I owned the first gen, the FRS, for 9 years. Long time. Been driving that for the last week. Big thanks to CardinaleWay Mazda for the Mazda MX-5 Miata loaner. And my buddies here, Lemuel Lopez and Nate, find their channels, Leem Wheezy and Onsite, linked below. Oh, getting into the GR86. This one has MXP catback exhaust and 12mm spacers on the wheels. And this is base, you can tell there's no Alcantara here. And I actually do like this, even though this is a $28,000 car, you got the auto right here, climate control, digital, which you're gonna see the MX-5 does not have that, even though it's a more expensive car. And for those wondering, we're rocking the Shunbun Grand Seiko SGBA 443. Picked that up in Tokyo, got the spring drive. I figured Japanese watch, Japanese sports car three-way comparison. Let's turn traction control off. There we go. The tack changes. We focus on the higher revs, which is what you want when you're on track. Now, first thing I noticed is that this car is a lot louder than mine because of the MXP catback exhaust, and maybe I'm just an old man. It's a little bit loud for me. I can tell it's probably gonna drone quite a bit on the highway too. But the engine on this, it doesn't have the best character, the best sound. It doesn't really encourage you to rev it out because as you get close to red line, it sounds like it's dying. I used to compare my first gen to a garbage disposal as you hit right around 5,000 to 6,000 RPM. But it has so much more torque down low. It's rated at 228 horsepower. The first gen was rated at 200, but that was probably more 190, 195. And the second gen is actually underrated. Based on dyno results, it looks like it's more around 240 horsepower at the crank. So a substantial bump, and that torque dip, right around 3.5 to 5,000 RPM from the first gen, is largely reduced with this new 2.4 liter flat 4 boxer engine. Not a perfect engine though. We of course know about the reliability issues, which we've talked about ad nauseum on this channel and on the podcast with Zygreen and the Topher. But weighing in at 2,800 pounds, I feel like this is very much a sweet spot for cars. Being right around 2,800, you get that lightweight nature without feeling like you're in a tin can or in a toy. Steering ratio is pretty fast. Front end is quite sharp. We have to remember this has McPherson strut front suspension, so initial turn-in might feel all right. It might actually feel sharper than you may think because the artificially fast steering ratio helps it feel more responsive. But when you start pushing it, it gives way to understeer quite easily. We had quite a few issues with that on track. Woohoo! There we go. That easily. It wants to wiggle its tail a little bit. There we go. That's why I love this car. It has a longer wheelbase. It's 101 inches. The other two, S2000 is around 95. Miata's around 91, I believe. And with that longer wheelbase, it's really easy to control when you get that tail out. Really, really easy. Part of that's the tuning as well. I actually like the GR86 suspension more than the BRZ because it is a little bit stiffer and the ride quality suffers slightly, but you get a little bit more playful of a nature, which for a car like this, I truly enjoy. I think in a vehicle like this, that's what draws me to it. Actually, I think that's one of its strengths, is the chassis dynamics, even at 7/10ths, kicking the tail out. I used to just get the tail out getting groceries, right? It's just so simple, so easy. Manual transmission is very light, and it has a bit of that mechanical nature, but it's not as tight as some, you know, the two other cars that we're driving today. Throttle response is also sometimes a little bit wonky. Sometimes you feel like you need to jab the throttle a little bit more. Sometimes, you know, depending on the rev range, like where you're at, you need to jab it lighter or softer than you may expect. So there's a bit of inconsistency there. Another thing I don't really like about this second gen is what they did to the steering. The steering in the first gen was really incredible, really a massive strength. And here they retuned it, and if you believe the marketing hype, it's supposedly better, but getting behind the wheel, I don't feel it's better at all. The feedback is reduced. I wonder if there's friction in the rack that's reducing that automatic recentering, because there's like this, the way I can best describe it is like a weird stickiness a little bit off center. And I had that same issue, that same complaint with my GR86. With the Primacy tires, 215 section width, this car is best enjoyed on public roads at lower speeds, because it'll still play with you in those circumstances. If you take this on track, which I did, I took up my bone stock GR86 to track, and it was a bit frustrating because when the tires are so low grip, you were just constantly hitting, you know, understeer, then oversteer. It just, you know, you need to upgrade the tire if you're going to do track work. But for just carving the canyons, staying on public roads, it gives you that playful nature that I think a lot of car enthusiasts want. The owner has the shift beep a little bit sooner than I would like, so I'm gonna wait a little bit after the beep to shift. I do think that at $28,000, this car is a stupid good deal. It is the cheapest out of the three. S2000s, I mean, obviously you're only gonna get those used, but to get a clean, low mileage example, and it depends on how clean and how low mileage you want, but you're gonna be pushing around 25 to 30K. And obviously that's a used car, so you're gonna have to give it some TLC afterwards. This one comes with a warranty, brand new. And yeah, the shifts here, they're good. Compared to most other vehicles on the market, this is still a good transmission. But as we're gonna find out, the Mazda Miata and S2000, they just take it to a whole new level, because those two transmissions, I think, are a step or two above this one. But I think that the suspension, they did a good job here of getting the desirable driving dynamics, right? Being playful at the limit. With comfort that's like, for a sports car, it's not too stiff. I think a lot of people complain about it. They're coming not from sports cars, they're coming from other more comfortable vehicles that are not sports cars. This car having such a low center of gravity allows them to have it softer sprung than a comparable vehicle that has a higher center of gravity, where you want the same level of body control because of just, I mean, physics. Obviously, cheaper car, not the most sophisticated suspension, but I think at the price point, they did a really good job here, at least in the warmer weather. You know, in colder climates, I hear these do have issues. Also, the only non-convertible out of the three, it has the most rigid chassis. Part of that is that it's not convertible. Part of it is also the chassis technology has come a long way in the last 2 decades from when the S2000 first came out. Woo-hoo! Love the dynamics of this car. Love, love, love. You can just get it right to that point. It's a really good learning tool because it's very easy. Everything's kind of like full grip versus getting to that rotation point where you're at the limit, about to lose traction, and then, you know, complete oversteer and, you know, getting it sideways. Those three are very, very easy to go from one to the next. And I think that makes this one of the strongest beginner's cars to teach you driving dynamics. And it's the easiest to learn, which has its upsides, but then the downsides is that when you do take it on track, the McPherson strut front suspension, as soon as you start pushing the times and pushing the car harder and start developing your skills, you do notice the deficiencies of the car relatively quickly, and you can get, you know, camber bolts like I did to get about 2.7 degrees of negative camber in the front, which helps, but you still want more than that because with McPherson strut, you don't get dynamic camber change as the suspension loads up. With double wishbone, you do. It actually gets more negative camber as the wheels go up, as the suspension compresses. So with this, with coilovers, camber plates, etc., you can get more than that. You can get 3.5, but it is a deficiency of this chassis. And with that out of the way, let's see how the Miata now compares. All right, next up is the 2024 Mazda MX-5 Miata. That's the ND3. We got new wheels for the 24. We got these LED headlights, LED taillights. They removed the DRLs from here, integrated them into the headlight assembly. Sol crystal red metallic, amazing color, love it, especially if you're colorblind and you wear colorblind sunglasses. This thing is so beautiful. Gonna have the top up because it's very windy. Wanna make sure you guys can hear. I actually like this touch. I hear some people finding it jarring. I think it's cool, makes the car feel a little bit more special. New for the ND3, we have a larger infotainment here, better screen resolution, thinner bezels. We also have this new mode for track mode, DSC off, essentially traction control mode where it's not fully off, but it allows you to get that slip angle. Also, new steering for the ND3. They reduced friction throughout the rack compared to the ND2 and retuned the E-Pass. Redline here is to 7,500. It's only 100 RPM more than the GR86, which is 7,400. But the engine here is smoother. We're powered by a 2-liter inline 4. This is the same engine from the ND2. Not as torquey as that GR86. This one makes 181 horsepower. That one's 228, but again, that thing's underrated at 240. But this one, it sounds much better as you rev it out. It actually encourages you to drive it harder. Whereas that GR86, you always feel like, am I braking it? It sounds like it's struggling. It doesn't really egg you on the way that this thing does. Steering here is definitely an improvement over the ND2. That's a point of controversy, actually. We have a few videos about it, which you can learn more about there. But the on-center feedback and texture far, far improved. And I would say the ND2 versus GR86 steering, I slightly prefer the GR86. It has this weird stickiness on center, but it had better feedback. Whereas this has significantly better steering than the GR86. I would choose this over the GR86 if steering was my #1 priority. You don't have that on-center stickiness. You get some texture. The front end is actually, it has a more natural turn-in. The GR86 has this artificial turn-in because of the really fast ratio and that McPherson strut. So you kind of get like an inconsistency depending on how hard you're turning and how fast you're going. Whereas this, part of that is the double wishbone front suspension. It's also a much lighter car. This thing weighs 2,350-ish pounds with the soft top version. You get the RF, it's about 100 pounds more. But I'm loving the steering in this new ND3. Shortest wheelbase out of the three, somewhere around 91 inches. And it's also really softly sprung, so it has the most comfortable ride. But you get this a lot of, I mean, you're learning about weight transfer with the soft suspension, which is good, but it takes a while to set into the turn. And if you're pushing it, you don't want that because there's a little bit of like a delay, a little bit of uncertainty as to what the car is doing. It can sometimes surprise you with oversteer. Yeah, getting a little bit of rotation there, which we love. Part of that is the new LSD. They've actually retuned it. It's an asymmetrical LSD. Oh, nice. Yeah, actually, we need to compare this against the a manual ND2 because I drove an automatic ND2 just recently on the same road. Based on my memory of the manual ND2 I drove, I'd say this one has a little bit more rotation on corner exit, which we love, right? That's from the asymmetrical LSD. which it locks up less on exit now to help with that rotation, and locks up more on entry to reduce the trail braking oversteer, which they got a lot of with the ND2. So we're gonna take this Jeep. Now I did also drive an ND2 on this road very recently, but the issue is that that's the automatic. That doesn't come with an LSD, because Mazda knows people that are buying an automatic Miata, they don't care about driving dynamics, not nearly as much as the person who's driving a manual, right? And for that reason, for cost savings, they don't include an LSD. This is the Grand Touring spec. Now, I would actually prefer the club spec with the BBS, Brembo, and Recaro package. That's going to come around 37-ish, if I'm not mistaken. I think the club is around 32, and then you add 4 or 5 for that package. This is the Grand Touring, and you get a few more creature comforts, but I think a lot of people who are considering these three, they're going to go with the club. The price on this, I think for a lot of you guys who are watching, it just may not be worth it if you're going to be pushing the car harder. One thing I did find interesting is that this doesn't have a digital climate control. I don't really care about dual zone versus single zone in a really small car. That's not the point. The point is that it's not digital, and having a digital readout just makes it feel a little bit nicer, easier to use ever so slightly, a little more premium. And the GR86, which is cheaper than this, has that, right? So maybe they're bringing that for the next Miata they release. I like cars that don't have too much torque. Call it a bug, I call it a feature, because it encourages you to rev it out. What is technically better is not always experientially better. And the GR86 has more torque, but I don't like revving that out as much as I like revving this out. This car does feel a little bit more whimsical, whereas that GR86 feels a little bit more serious. And that's, I think, primarily the suspension tuning. This being soft, having a lot of body roll, that one being far more planted. But even though this is whimsical, it's not as playful, because that GR86, it'll let you kick the tail out time and time again. Whereas this one, you gotta work for it a little bit more. A lot more weight transfer. You can't just use the torque or the power to kick the tail loose. And also when you do, it's a shorter wheelbase, so you gotta be quicker to catch it. Not quite as quick as the S2000, even though that has a longer wheelbase, around 95-ish inches. That one tends to be a little bit more razor edge. You gotta be careful with it. Transmission here, I think is actually, it might be the best one to use. I prefer the S2000 shifter because it has shorter shifts, it feels a little bit more mechanical, a little tighter. That bolt action rifle cliche is very applicable. But this one, it does have longer throws, a little bit more spacing between gates. And it's still very, very mechanical and crisp. But the reason I say this might be better is that you're probably more likely to miss shift an S2000 than this, based on how they're designed. This is a really good manual transmission. Throttle response is very natural, as you can see there. Very easy to rev match, also heel toe, good pedal placement. I feel like all three of these cars actually have really good pedal placement, which is something that we take for granted in such well-designed, drivers-focused cars, because there are a lot of other cars out there on the market that do not have great pedal placement. And if you're driving a manual, that's really important to get the most you can out of that experience. Whereas that GR86 had that kind of inconsistency with the throttle and with the steering, the Miata here feels much more natural, feels much more one-to-one. There's not as much of a learning curve having to deal with the weirdness of the vehicle. You think about what you want the car to do, you give it an input, and then it just follows that one-to-one, which I very much appreciate in a sports car. Oh yeah. not quite as playful as the GR86 in that it's as willing to get the tail out and as willing to hold a slide and as easy to control. But you can still, without too much effort, get this thing to dance and play with you. It's still a lively car, absolutely. Now, the reason I was saying that 2800 feels like a really good sweet spot for a sports car is that this car weighs substantially less, 2350, right, versus 2800. I'd say, yeah, 2800 to me is like a sweet spot. Because when you get lighter, you start feeling the compromises of a smaller car. There are benefits to the lighter vehicle, right, when it comes to the chassis dynamics, the acceleration, deceleration, handling, etc. But you now start to really feel that this is a much lighter and smaller car. Whereas in those GR86s, BRZs as an example, you don't feel as much compromise. Like driving this day to day, this is going to be a really hard single-purpose vehicle. The GR86, on the other hand, insanely practical. I dailied an FRS for 9.5 years, my only vehicle, and it's a clown car. I would actually compare its practicality, I'm not even kidding, I would compare it closer to a sedan than to a sports car. The Mazda Miata and the S2000, the gap between them and the GR86 is larger than the gap between the GR86 and a sedan. Let me say that. That's probably a better way to put it. Because that thing, you fold the seats down, you can fit a bicycle back there. I moved between apartments many times, obviously not taking furniture, but all my other belongings, all my clothes, electronics, all that stuff fit in that car. It's truly a clown car. And in a pinch, yeah, you do have those two back seats. Are they going to be comfortable? No, but I have driven people in the back and it does work. Can't really sit behind me because I'm taller, I have long legs, so there's, you can't really have legs behind me. The seat goes all the way, but I've had two people to my right. And are they comfortable? No. But if we get from point A to point B safely, yes. And now, finally, it's time for the 2006 Honda S2000 AP2. Gonna keep the top up for your audio pleasure. A very purpose-built interior, which we love. I love that you have the actual key here and the engine start button separate. The ignition and starter being separate, I think, makes it feel a little bit more special, like an occasion every time you get behind the wheel. Now, unlike the other two, we do not have tilt and telescoping steering, so the ergonomics here aren't as ideal, unless you're just lucky and you have a really good body type. I do like that this is a very purpose-built cockpit. So you got like the cover over the CD player. I think that's great. The tack inspired by the McLaren Honda 1990s Formula One car that Senna drove. Some people think it's corny. I think it's actually a really nice touch. And all the buttons here, they actually still feel good after all these years. Now this is also rated at 240 horsepower, so you may think that this is going to smoke the GR86, but that GR86 has way more torque. So you really need to rev this thing out to get it to move. Brakes, we need some different brake compound, and probably a brake fluid flush too. They're quite a bit soft, but the brakes have never been a strength of the S2000. They have single piston calipers, and if I'm gonna get an S2000 and start doing track work, I'm gonna get a big brake kit. Not because it can't handle a single track day, but because you're gonna be going through pads and rotors very quickly with the stock setup. I love, love, love the transmission in this thing. It is the most special out of the three. It is the most mechanical, tightest action. It feels just so metallic and tight. Again, some people are going to consider the ND3 Miata to have a better transmission than this, but I think most people would probably agree that this is a more enjoyable transmission to use. Love the AP2 transmission. F22C engine. The red line is at 8,000 rather than 9,000 from the AP1, which is the F20C engine. But we get a little bit more torque, still a very low torque engine. And the reason they had to reduce that red line is because there's a greater stroke. So the piston is traveling a larger distance. This is an older car. We have almost 100,000 miles. Almost 20 years old. It's amazing that it's still relevant today when there are these newer sports cars. God, what a joy to drive this car. But the rawness, right? It's something that I missed. When I went from FRS to GR86, that was actually a complaint I had. Because now that I have a daily driver, this is not a car you want a daily drive, but if you have a daily driver, you want your sports car to feel like an occasion every time you get behind the wheel. This thing does that. This thing feels special, hardcore, it beats you up a little bit. What makes for a good sports car does not make for a good daily driver car. They're two very different things. Now, going through those corners back there, you saw me sawing a little bit more at the wheel because there's no feedback. Out of the three, this has by far the weakest steering rack. They slowed it down a little bit for the AP2. I prefer the AP1 faster ratio. You do get a little bit of something, but in the aftermarket, you know, I drove a really amazing example of an S2000, my gold standard, and that one with spherical bushings and maximizing the caster. The steering on that one was actually really, really good. So it is, oh my God, buddy. It's always an Ultima driver, isn't it? Oh God. But the reason that the steering is the weakest on this car, and I've seen reviews where people are like, oh yeah, the steering on all three is kind of the same. Like, no, it's not. You got to keep in mind the actual strengths, weaknesses, and biases of every reviewer. So based on my history, plastic surgery, but even when I was younger, I really honed my dexterity. I did a lot of things from when I was like 5 years old through adulthood. And steering to me is a very important part of the driving experience. It may not be for other people, and that's okay. If steering doesn't bother you much, you're not going to find much issue with the S2000, but strongest steering by far is the Miata, then the GR86, and the S2000 is dead last. This is the early, I think actually the first E-Pass from Honda, and the feedback is just really, really limited. The weighting, I mean, it's actually quite lighter than you'd expect. You think, hey, older car, maybe heavier rack versus newer one. Not necessarily. Doesn't really load up as you turn. You get very little feedback through the wheel. And even though I am, not sure what this guy's doing, but even though I am somewhat of a steering purist, that's not the only thing that matters in a car, right? So for those who watched the other video on Miata versus S2000, I talked about how I'm considering getting one of these as a future track toy. But this thing has that extra X factor. It brings out the emotionality when you drive that I think the Miata, it's still fun, but it doesn't quite excite me in the same way that the S2000 does. And a big part of that is the engine. This car is bone stock except for the intake, as you can tell from the induction note. I think stock for stock, the AP1 is actually the stronger vehicle. The better S2000, they say, versus the better sports car being the AP2. Not sure how much I agree with that. I think the AP1, to me, is a more fun and engaging sports car to drive. But anyways, for long-term ownership, reliability, track work, etc., if you're going to modify the car, the AP2 is the one you want to get. You're going to have squeaks and rattles in an older car. The chassis is not going to be as stiff. It's not going to be as safe of a vehicle either. But that's part of the price you pay. I think the cost is worth the benefit. It's always been one of those vehicles that I loved, especially one in yellow. Rio yellow, such a gorgeous color. I remember driving that Rio yellow S2000 in Gran Turismo all the time as a kid. I played Gran Turismo 1 through 5. Now I'm on the sim rig instead. We're actually going to have another channel for sim racing. Stay tuned for that in the coming weeks. All three of these cars are willing to rotate with trail braking was actually an issue with the FRS, the first Gen 86, because the traction control system was just not well calibrated, well dialed in. But in the second gen, it allows for trail braking. The Miata, of course, doesn't do too much initially, which is why they dialed it back with the asymmetrical LSD. And of course, the S2000 does that too. When we get these out on track, we'll be able to push them even further and show you that limit handling. But here on these public roads, obviously not going to push it beyond 7/10. But the nice thing about the S2000 is that even though the steering isn't the most communicative, the chassis is very communicative. So you can understand a lot of what the car is doing just on the seat of your pants. Being an older car with a lot of miles, the suspension definitely needs a bit of TLC, updated bushings, things like that. It's a bit crashy, a bit harsh. And you have to keep that in mind when you're considering these different options. Getting new with a warranty straight from factory has certain advantages over getting something that's used. It's a little bit more tired, that's been around the block. Between the three cars, the GR86 has a McPherson strut, whereas the Miata and the S2000 have double wishbone front suspension. And you can actually notice that even at canyon speeds, the turn-in on this and the Miata is more natural, and it doesn't give way to understeer as easily as the GR86. You're gonna notice that a lot on track, but some people say that, hey, you know, driving around town, you don't really notice the difference. You definitely do. Once you start pushing it even a little bit, that also helps with the more natural feeling of the front end between the Miata and the S2000. I think the Miata actually has the best feeling front end, not because it has the sharpest front end necessarily, but because the steering with the suspension geometry and the lightweight makes for a very natural front end. The S2000 does have a nice sharp front end as well, and all of these cars have very good weight distributions too, with only either close 50-50 or only slightly to the front. You know, the S2000, Miata, they're front midship, right? The engine is actually behind the front wheels. That helps with the turn-in as well. But you're gonna notice that even more when you start pushing it. And for those who are watching this channel and want to do track work, that is something that can actually make a pretty big difference in your driving enjoyment. Try driving a stock GR86 on track, and you're gonna get frustrated quite a bit. I mean, the character of this engine is, in my opinion, by far the strongest. This is, you know, you have VTEC, you have that 1990s Honda engine, naturally aspirated, not very torquey, but really high redline. It sings and encourages you to push it harder. I love that. Out of the three engines, I'd say this is the strongest for my preference, right? If you want something that's more torquey, then yeah, get the GR86. The Mazda Miata, I think, has the second strongest engine. The GR86, while it does have the most torque, it's the most usable, it doesn't really encourage you in the same way that these two do. But between the three, for just driving enjoyment, I mean, first of all, you can't go wrong with any one. The fact that we have these options, we really need to be grateful. I think car enthusiasts are so adept at being complainers, but having these three cars as options at a relatively affordable price point, we truly are lucky. Let's go through the pros and cons of each. I think if you want a single vehicle, you're a young guy, GR86 or BRZ all the way, because this is the most practical by far. It is not even a comparison. The things you can fit in this car, the comfort, etc., the refinement, this is gonna be the most comfortable day to day. But if you want something as a toy, as a second or third vehicle, I'm looking for my third vehicle. I got my Amira, I got my CX-50, and a track toy. It's between these two. Now, I think that the S2000, it has a little bit more of that X factor, the emotionality, the excitement of it, even though the steering isn't very good. The drivetrain, the engine, transmission are amazing in this. I think my favorite out of the three, although you can make alternate points for the other two based on torque, things like that. The Mazda Miata, you can get this new, right? It has the best steering out of the bunch. I'd say steering first place, second place, third place. The GR86 steering has that weird stickiness. It has a bit of feedback, not as good as the first gen. Artificially fast ratio, doesn't feel quite as natural. This has by far the best steering rack. So natural, great feedback now with the ND3. The ND2 is a bit numb. They reduced the friction from the ND2 to the ND3, and by reducing that floor, you actually get a lot more signal the feedback is improved in this. And that's actually why I was considering this as my track toy, because I love the steering so much, and I think it's such a well-balanced vehicle. It's so dialed in. Mazda has put in a lot of time, effort, and money with the motorsport part of this car. You can't say the same about the other two. But the reason I can't really go Miata and I have to go S2000 is because of that X factor, that emotionality. I think technically speaking, this is a more proficient car. This is a much more comfortable ride, although it is, you know, a little bit too roly-poly. You can fix that in the aftermarket pretty easily. I think that technically speaking, this is a more proficient vehicle, right? It's newer, it's safer, the steering is better, the transmission is almost as good, not quite as good as the S2000, the drivetrain, not quite as good, but I think a lot of people are gonna enjoy the Mazda Miata. That's what they say, Miata is always the answer, but it doesn't quite have that same emotionality and X factor as the S2000. I was pretty set on an S2000 before driving this, but the ND3 has such a steering improvement over the ND2 that it made me reconsider. But my friends, big thanks to CardinaleWay Mazda out here in Las Vegas. I get my CX-50 service from them all the time. Love their service, and they also give back to the Las Vegas community. Gotta love that. Check out On Site. This is Nate's S2000, and check out Liam Wheezy. This is Liam Wells' Toyota GR86. My friends, if you had around 30K to spend, which one would you go for? The GR86, the Honda S2000, or the ND3 Miata? I already told you which one I would go for. Let me know your thoughts and comments down below. Much love, my friends. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you all in that next one.